I'll begin this afternoon's session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I will be hosting today's session. Today is Tuesday, February 18th, 2025, and this is the third session in the e-lecture series entitled Advances in Operational Forestry, Tree Planting, and Carbon Mitigation Research. This series is a collaborative effort coordinated between the Canadian Forest Service and the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate and host these webinars. For today's session, we are pleased to have Dr. Shawn Leroux, who will give an exciting presentation titled Effects of Spruce Budworm on Carbon Stocks and Fluxes in Eastern Boreal Forests. To kick things off, Dr. Leroux is a professor in the Department of Biology at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Dr. Leroux's research group uses observational, experimental, and modeling to understand how species interactions and natural disturbances impact ecosystem functions, such as carbon sequestration and nitrogen cycling. For over 2 decades, this research has focused on the Canadian Boreal forest. With that, I will now pass it over to Dr. Leroux.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thanks everybody for coming. Thanks, Sharon, for organizing today's talk and your great organization of the series. I'm really happy to talk to everyone today about a system I've been studying, learning about for over a decade in particular. In Boreal, a little bit longer than that, but this Eastern Spruce Budworm system a bit, I would say about 12, 13 years. And it continues to fascinate me because of images like this. So this is an image from a helicopter over Cape Breton Highlands National Park. And so this is the Boreal forest. And doesn't really look like that, at least characteristic of a Boreal forest. You see a lot of standing dead snags, and that's from a Spruce Budworm outbreak in the 1970s. And this image was taken, probably less than 10 years ago. So on the ground, you see grass, a lot of grass species. If you squint your eyes a little bit in the image, you'll see some balsam fir that are, trying to regenerate, but failing to do so because there are other herbivores in the system that feed on them, like moose. What's striking about this image to me is that, it's not just a local scale. You see this spanning across huge areas over landscapes, right? So it's really, I find this puzzling to think, well, you have this natural disturbance, Spruce Budworm, that's, native to this boreal system. And yet this boreal system is not regenerated, 30, 40 years after this disturbance. So it continues to puzzle me and has me studying it from a perspective ecologically, but also from a forest management perspective. So before I get going, I want to thank a lot of the collaborators that have helped me learn about this system and that have really shaped how I study this system. So great colleagues at Memorial University like Yolanda and Louise, colleagues at Parks Canada, so Derek, John, and others, where we do a lot of our field research. Our colleagues at Natural Resources Canada, like Joe and Eric, and then a whole suite of students, postdocs, master students, and Ph.D. students as well, who've worked on projects in the past decade and a half. When I present any slides or any work from students, I'll make sure to note their contributions there. Now, as a disclaimer, these are collaborators that helped me learn about this system, but the opinions I'm presenting today are my own. So if you disagree with them, well, we can talk about that. All that to say that they may not represent all the opinions of everyone listed here, but certainly everyone here has really played an important role in helping me to dive into this Eastern Boreal system. Just quickly, funding agencies, a lot of funding over the past several years from NSERC, Parks Canada, Nature Conservancy, Government of Newfoundland Labrador, Natural Resources Canada, and my university. So I'm going to have a three-pronged approach to my talk today. Maybe we can think of them as actors, perhaps. The main protagonist, maybe it's an antagonist, being Eastern Spruce Budworm. So I'll start with a little bit of background on that species in case you're not familiar with it as a disturbance agent. Then we'll talk a little bit about carbon, starting to make links on how natural disturbances can impact carbons and the role of forests in carbon sequestration. And I'll try to put them together with our last section on forest management. So what are some approaches we're using to manage this disturbance with implications for biodiversity, for forest health, for forest carbon. All right, so let's get started with our first section just on the ecology of spruce budworm. So this is a moth species, Leptoptera, and as such, it has a complex life history. In the fall, it'll hibernate throughout the winter as an L2 or a larvae, second instar larvae. It emerges in May, and in the June period, kind of coinciding with the bud bursts of our conifer species like balsam fir and spruce species, goes through a rapid feeding and growth phase. It'll pupae in the midsummer, and then in July will emerge as adult moths, and that's when we see a lot of dispersal of the moth species to, maybe colonize new stands or move around the landscape, and this is where we see the potential for outbreaks to emerge. The geographic distribution of the species is as follows. So this is a diagram with a few different budworms. The eastern spruce budworm is the dark gray here. So it goes everywhere from Newfoundland boreal forest through the Maritimes, Quebec, Ontario, and then up through sort of northern parts of this boreal forest. Not very common west of the Rockies, but common in other areas, particularly in eastern boreal forests. Now, the geographic distribution of this species matches very closely the geographic distribution, as you would expect, of its main food resource. And so this is a diagram looking at the range of balsam fir, which is the primary host or food resource of eastern spruce budworm. So if we put these side by side, we can see, there's a pretty good matching here for the geographic distribution of balsam fir across the boreal, particularly eastern and central, and then of budworm. And so one of the reasons for this geographic distribution and this sort of that why balsam fir is an important food resource is the timing by which the needles are available for foraging by the caterpillars of eastern spruce budworm. So in this diagram, this is a study out of Quebec. We have years on the x-axis from 2010 to 2019, and these researchers looked at when the buds of two species here, we have balsam fir on the left, and then black spruce on the right, when they burst. So essentially meaning that you see the needles emerging, and then that essentially becomes a potential food resource for spruce budworm. And then we have the year, day of the year on the y-axis, and I'll just point to the circles here with the bars of variation. So on average across this 9-year period, they found that balsam fir on the left here emerges around, early June to mid-June, and black spruce sort of mid-June to late June, anywhere for about 10 to 15 days later. And so that means that balsam fir is one of the earliest resources available for when eastern spruce budworm are emerging and entering that rapid growth phase. So this is one of the reasons why we think that this is the primary host for eastern spruce budworm, and why we see this tight coupling between the distribution of balsam fir and of this moth species. We know that the frequency and magnitude of eastern spruce budworm outbreaks is variable. Both those things are variable. So this is a diagram where we kind of go back in, from the 1500s to 2000. It was data from tree cores for a number of trees in Quebec, data from Boulanger and Arsenault. And so I want to point out two things with this diagram. First, the peaks here represent the percentage of trees that are affected from this data set by a spruce budworm outbreak. And you can see that that's variable. You have anywhere from a very severe outbreak where, 80, 90, 100% of trees that were sampled appear to have some evidence that they were defoliated or impacted by spruce budworm, all the way to, maybe only 40%. During some outbreak phases, we see a reduced amount of the magnitude of that severity of defoliation. So that's the first thing. The magnitude varies. Sometimes you can have very severe outbreaks. Sometimes they could be less severe in terms of the amount of trees that are impacted. The second point to make is the periodicity, or how frequent they are. So on average, we tend to think that outbreaks can occur usually around 30 to 40 years, but it's not the type of cycle that's as strict as some other cycles we know from boreal forests. Let's think of, Canada lynx and snowshoe hare in northern boreal forests, where it's, pretty close to a 10-year cycle where you see these boom and bust dynamics. So we can see sometimes it's 30 or 40 years between outbreaks. Sometimes they occur less frequently, maybe of magnitudes that are variable. What we do know, though, is that they are always present in our forests, right? They're native to our boreal forests, and at present in, we'll say, sub-epidemic levels, right? And that every so often, 30, 40 years on average, they reach very large population abundances, epidemic levels where we could see outbreak dynamics. So a few ways to look at measuring spruce budworm. We're really interested. When is the next outbreak going to happen, right? From a forest management perspective, this is a critical question. Even from an ecological perspective, right? This is a huge food resource for a number of different consumers in our boreal forests. So we're curious, we're interested in monitoring populations to know when we're going to hit that threshold for the potential for an outbreak to occur. So one thing we can monitor could be moths. So moths. So we have sampling stations where different agencies are counting moths, right? When we see high levels of moths, that might indicate areas of dispersal, might indicate population is growing at certain times of the year. And this is just an image depicting moth counts for different areas in eastern Canada. When we have outbreak dynamics, these moth dispersal events and the numbers of moths can be outstanding, and they can actually be picking up on radar. So this is an image on the left here, an example of that, where it looks like, based on radar, it looks like it's snow falling in the middle of July. On the ground, here are two images, one from 1957 outbreak, one from 2016 outbreak in Campbellton, showing this, snow-like structure, and on the ground, apparently it's very slippery as well. So this really points to the abundance by which, when we're in an outbreak of eastern spruce budworm, you can see a lot of moths, you can see a lot of larvae, a lot of caterpillars in these boreal forests. Another important component of the life cycle of budworm, which is measured, is that L2 stage. So this is the second instar larvae, which usually occurs in the fall season, which, if you measure abundances in the fall, can give you an idea, right, of what you might expect in terms of population abundances into the spring and the next spring and summer season, right? If you have a high number of L2 in an area one fall, you might expect a high number to have overwintered, potentially survived, and emerge in May and June. So these are just sampling plots in New Brunswick, again, from a study in 2019, where the different colors represent different L2 counts. The way it's done is usually you clip branches off of trees and you count the number of L2 per branch. So a lot of blue dots here suggesting there's very low counts, at least in these surveys, but some of them are showing up in this red and orange state. And so it's generally when we see L2 counts of 7 or larger, we start to think that we might be approaching outbreak levels, or that we're going to see a significant number of individuals in the following spring and summer. So this is another way that we can monitor populations, get a sense of what we might see in the following summer and so on. Because these insects can have such an impact on our forests, particularly in outbreak years, there's a lot of interest in trying to determine or predict where we might see severe defoliation occurring if we were to have an outbreak. And so Bo Zhang here, the postdoc in my group, did some modeling to try and do this on the island of Newfoundland. So we looked at the literature to find important predictors from other areas for trying to determine where spruce budworm might have high populations and therefore high defoliation of forest species. So things like temperature has an impact on these insects, precipitation, elevation, what forest species are there, right? If their preferred host is in the area. So we had geographic information data, spatially explicit data on precipitation patterns in the spring, in the summer, temperature patterns for different times of the year. And so we combine this information to then develop a predictive map to say, well, in this current outbreak phase, when we're currently in a phase in Newfoundland where we're at the start or maybe in the middle of an outbreak, at least in the western Newfoundland, where might we expect areas to be defoliated? And so this is our predictive map. The red areas are areas with a high probability of predicted severe defoliation. The greener areas are areas where we predict a lower probability of severe defoliation. White here is just areas where we either don't have inference or there's no significant forests, or areas where we didn't have data, like the national parks here. So you can see there's large swaths that if we reached epidemic levels, we could expect to see severe defoliation. One thing interesting from this analysis is that central Newfoundland here, which is generally warmer than the coasts, but also has less balsam fir than the coastal environments on the west coast and east coast of Newfoundland. But we see a really high probability of seeing defoliation here during this outbreak phase, and I think that has a lot to do with temperature being optimal physiologically for this insect species. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background on our main protagonist here, Eastern Spruce Budworm. Now I want to shift gears a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about carbon, and then I'll stitch them together, or attempt to do so, with our last section on forest management. Okay, here's a carbon cycle diagram, but bear with me here. I'm not going to have many of these. I think it sketches an important point that our forests play a really important role in carbon cycling. So we have trees, we have different plant species that are taking carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis. They're transforming that into its own biomass, where it can be locked up for decades, and even much longer periods. They're also respiring some of that, so they're releasing CO2 through their activities, through respiration. We have disturbances like wildfire, that is burning some of that material, releasing emissions into the atmosphere. Spruce budworm is similar in some ways, right? It can, when you have severe defoliation in a stand for 3, 4, 5 years, that can lead to the death of mature trees, which then means we have a lot of dead, decaying wood in our forests. And that means that that's going to be decomposing and releasing carbon into the atmosphere through that decomposition. This carbon cycle is tightly linked to climate change. Briefly touch on this because we're going to come back to that with our interest in trying to manage disturbances as a natural solution to climate change. So we have radiation from the sun coming down to the Earth's surface. Some of that is absorbed. A lot of it is absorbed by the Earth. Some of it is reflected back. Our greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, kind of creates this shield where it absorbs some of that reflected radiation and scatters it back. Some of it goes back to the Earth's surface, and that's how it creates this warming effect, where it's essentially locking in more of that solar radiation, and to which we're seeing climate change happening. Forests are a critical player here. So our trees and other plant species are sequestering, they're locking in carbon from the atmosphere into their own biomass. And then when they die, they're releasing that carbon back to the atmosphere. So they're a really important part of carbon cycling at a global scale. And the Boreal, obviously being one of the biggest biomes, forested biomes on the planet, has an important role in global climate regulation. There's lots of studies that have demonstrated this. So this is just one example here where the authors found that there's a large persistent carbon sink in the world's forests. So that just means, a sink means that the forests are sequestering, holding in more carbon than they're releasing. And so this has led to a lot of interesting initiatives, like the federal government's 2 billion tree program, right? Where the vision here is that if we can plant trees that are locking in that carbon dioxide, maybe it's, can contribute in a positive way to climate mitigation strategies. I mean, obviously it's not going to solve climate change, right? We need to do a lot more in order to achieve that. But if we can think about nature as contributing positively to reducing emissions, then I think there's some interesting thoughts there. And this is where forest management becomes important as well, right? Not just from planting trees, but how we manage our forests in different ways. So a big question is whether our forests are going to continue to be carbon sinks. Are they going to absorb more carbon and keep it there, then release carbon in the future, particularly as we're seeing warming trends and as we have natural disturbances like Eastern Spruce Budworm and wildfires occurring, which can sort of switch those forests from being a sink to a source, in the sense that they would be releasing more carbon than they're actually sequestering. So in order to understand the role of forests in carbon sequestration or carbon budgets, we can just think of a carbon budget, which I'll sketch now. You can think of the inputs of carbon. Maybe that's your atmospheric carbon dioxide. You're going to have some of that stored within a system. So could be trees that are using that through photosynthesis, locking it into their own biomass, right? And then there's some outputs. Maybe some mature trees die, you have decomposition, you have a release of that carbon back to the atmosphere. Important to this this carbon budget is that the stocks and fluxes, so the stocks being, locked up into, let's say, trees or soils, and the fluxes being the emissions, they're dynamic in space and time. So if you were to measure carbon stocks or flux in one forest stand versus another, you would get very different estimates depending on the composition of those stands, depending on the soil structures in there, depending on whether you were looking at it over a day, over a week, over a year. So it's important then to think about our carbon budgets and to estimate them over a specific area and time whenever we're doing this. The general equation underlying a lot of our carbon budgeting, a lot of the global circulation models is this simple carbon budget model, which is on the left-hand side, we have net ecosystem production, which is essentially the quantity of carbon in the system. And then that's a function of net primary production minus heterotrophic respiration. So let's just walk through these two things. So net primary production is just plant production, how much biomass is accruing year to year. So we have new leaves, we have new needles, we have new branches, we have incremental growth of tree biomass at a trunk level. And then we have a loss due to respiration, right? Plants are respiring carbon dioxide as they're doing some of these activities, and that's called gross primary production. The emissions in this equation tend to be resulting from decomposition of dead and soil organic matter. So you might have dead decaying trees, right, that have maybe fallen over either through disturbance like wind or budworm, for example, and other activities where you have emissions occurring through decomposition processes. So if we thought about a landscape that looks something like this, where we have some mature stands, which are the greenish images here, and then you have some recently burned stands maybe that are black. If we wanted to think about this landscape and measure the carbon budget of a landscape, we'd really have to think about carbon budget of each one of these individual stands. So for example, maybe we have net ecosystem production for this mature forest stand. That would give us, for that area, given a certain amount of time in that forest, the estimated carbon budget. We might have a budget estimated for this recently burned area, right? That's an area that's probably emitting, at least in the first few years following fire, more carbon than it is locking into new biomass due to this disturbance. We can have a net ecosystem production for a bigger mature forest area and so on, right? For every type of stand we might have in a landscape, we sum those together, and that's going to give us an idea of an overall landscape level carbon budget. Is our landscape a sink across this whole area, right? Is it locking in more carbon than it's losing, or is it a source? Is it releasing more carbon than it's actually sequestering? This is an image I use a lot. I love this paper and this image by Werner Kurz and colleagues. And it provides a different perspective on this sort of dynamic. So the bottom panel here, we start with a mature forest. Maybe there's a disturbance, could be fire, could be eastern spruce budworm, where now we have trees that have either combusted, right, or they're dead or dying and decomposing. We don't have a lot of growth, at least a few years initially after disturbance. Then the forest goes through a regeneration phase as trees take root, eventually to come back to some semblance of a mature forest that may be similar or slightly different than the original one. On the top part of this diagram, it tracks the components of our net ecosystem production, our carbon budget. So the middle line is the net ecosystem production. The top line is net primary production. That's like your plant growth. And then your bottom line is your heterotrophic respiration. The horizontal line is the zero line. So any time you're above that line, your forest is a sink, sequestering more carbon than it's releasing. Anytime you're below that line, your forest is a source. It's releasing more carbon than it is sequestering. So we could see that after disturbance, there's a few years where your forests tend to be sources, right? There's a lot of dead, dying material that is releasing carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. There's not a lot of growth initially of trees and other plants back into this regeneration phase. And so we can see that there is some growth, but it's not keeping pace with the emissions. So we see overall that forest can be a sink post-disturbance. Maybe 10 to 20 years after disturbance, there's a rapid growth of trees as they start to take the seedlings and saplings take root, and they start to accrue a lot of biomass. You can see rapid increase in net primary production, a slowing down of emissions due to decomposition, and that's when your forest then becomes a sink, right? It's locking in more carbon than it's releasing. As your forest matures, you don't see the growth tends to slow down, right? Mature trees don't put on as much biomass as the very young growing trees might do. And so we see that those forests tend to be sinks, but less of a large sink than that rapid growth phase. So if we look at it again, we bring back this landscape. Different stands in your landscape could be at different phases of this diagram, right? And have different carbon budgets. So that recently disturbed plot here, right, that was fired might be a source of carbon. Your mature forest, that's over here in your diagram, might be a sink for carbon. So really trying to understand how those different pieces across the landscape come together to give us the sort of overall carbon budget for a landscape. Okay, there are lots of reasons why a landscape or even just one forest stand can go from a sink to a source and vice versa. And this diagram sort of depicts some of these, and I'll just briefly touch on a couple of them. Reasons why a forest stand might become a sink: well, you're recovering from a disturbance, there's reforestation, right? So you're in a rapid growth phase, and so you're accruing a lot of primary production. And so you're seeing the forest sequester more carbon than it's releasing. Some reasons why you might be a source: well, maybe you had a recent fire, maybe there's a pest infestation, you have a lot of decomposition occurring, and so then you're seeing more emissions being released by that forest stand than being sequestered by the forest stand. Okay, so that's a little bit about carbon. Now I'm going to try and put them together to think about how some strategies for managing eastern spruce budworm with implications for biodiversity, carbon, and a healthy forest. Okay, there's a lot of interest the past decade, I would say, in using forest management or thinking about our forests as a natural solution to climate change. I've talked about that already. What that means is thinking about how we use our forests, how we manage disturbances like fire and like biotic agents like eastern spruce budworm. From an eastern spruce budworm perspective, we're collecting a lot of data. Different agencies are doing this at a provincial level, a federal level, a lot of collaboration to try and understand the dynamics of the species. There's a treatment or spraying program, which I'll go through in a couple slides, that is meant to try to reduce the impacts of outbreaks. I think what's really interesting from this system is the use of citizen science, right? Really engaging citizens to try and contribute to collecting data and tracking the movement of these organisms. So there's Budworm Tracker, there's a link here. There are these moth boards, which researchers at Natural Resources Canada, like Joe Bowden, have created. This is one in a national park where there's a light. Visitors can come and look at night and can see the moths and identify different moth species attracted to the light. They can log that information on online databases, and that helps to track biodiversity and the abundances of different species and areas. So it's a very clever use of citizen science to try and inform forest management, I think. The effects of a budworm outbreak on the forest industry can be really enormous. And this is why I think, one of the reasons why there's a lot of interest in this system. And so here's some infographics that are created by the Healthy Forest Partnership. The one on the bottom here, we see the extent of severe defoliation in New Brunswick, in a 1975 outbreak. And then in Quebec on the left here, in the, let's say, current or recent outbreak of 2016. So we're talking, millions of hectares of forests and timber that are affected by, potentially affected under a severe outbreak of eastern spruce budworm. Economically, this is data for New Brunswick. We know that is an important industry. So there's 5.6 million hectares of productive forest. almost $5 billion of direct and indirect contributions of this industry to gross domestic product, 12,000 jobs, lots of wood being produced in this industry. The estimates if an outbreak were to be severe and uncontrolled are enormous, right, economically. And these are sort of the numbers on the bottom where you might lose half of your productive forest, a lot of that income and many jobs over time. So one solution that's been advanced and is currently being applied to try and slow and maybe even stop the outbreak of the eastern spruce budworm is called the early intervention strategy. And this is the application of usually one of two, or sometimes a combination, two different products through aerial spraying of areas. Either BTK, which is Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a naturally occurring soil bacteria, which attacks the gut of the larvae. So this is usually sprayed in the fall to target that L2 stage of the life history of eastern spruce budworm, attacks the gut cell walls, prevents it from feeding, and would kill the larvae. Tibufenazide is another product, which is an insect growth regulator, which essentially speeds up the growth of these larvae, forcing them to pupate earlier, and then the similar process where they would starve to death. So this is one example of an approach that's being used to try and slow the advance of an outbreak. So the vision is that if you can know, if you're monitoring it frequently enough, and you can know the edge of that distribution of that species, that perhaps if you sprayed along that edge, you might prevent that leading edge from going forward. In the middle of an outbreak, of a severe outbreak, I don't think the application of these products would be sufficient to stop an outbreak all right. So usually in the case where you have an outbreak that's already occurring, it might be applied to certain forest stands as a protection strategy, right? We're going to target certain forest stands, which we know are valuable, either from a timber standpoint or ecological standpoint, and we're going to spray around that stand to protect that particular stand. Just an example of this in Newfoundland. So these are L2, these are data available on Newfoundland, Governor of Newfoundland website. These are data for L2 surveys in and around the Gros Morne area. So the red dots are surveys where we had more than 7 per branch count. So a lot in Gros Morne in certain in 2021 and previous years. This is where on the island of Newfoundland, we think the outbreak is mostly started. And as you move away from Gros Morne, you see a reduced count. So this is sort of, lined where the outbreak is at least somewhat currently contained, but will, as the dominant winds go from southwest, sort of moving from Gros Morne down across the island, we expect dispersal of adults in that direction. So the government's done a spraying strategy. So this is a map of their spray blocks in 2021, where the brown here represents areas that would have been sprayed. And you can see that it's concentrated around that edge where you see high counts based on L2 surveys in an attempt to try and slow the advance of that outbreak across the island of Newfoundland. The process outlined here in a paper by Dave McLean and colleagues, based on some success in New Brunswick, where this strategy has been applied, is you take some information on L2 surveys, right? You try to interpolate essentially the population of spruce budworm on the island. Oops. In an area. Then you look at the percentage of its hosts. So you look at the forest composition. Is there a lot of white spruce fir in this landscape? If there is, then you're more likely to expect that that could be an area that would see a severe outbreak. If you have more mixed wood, you would expect the outbreak to not advance as quickly in areas of mixed wood where there's not as much of the primary host of the species. You have a blocking tool where you don't spray obviously on water bodies and urban areas. So if you look at how this plays out spatially, so on the top left here, we have forecasted spruce budworm population based on L2 surveys, the red being higher numbers. We have treatment exclusion areas. So these could be roads, water bodies, urban areas. And then you have your forest stand percent spruce fir by volume. You put these 3 things together and that comes up with a treatment priority area. This is your reddish areas where you might prioritize spraying in order to try and reduce the spread of that outbreak across the landscape. This is an example of the spray program in New Brunswick. from 2014 to 2018. So we see, and the treatments here are in purple on the left. So we see a little bit of treatment in 2014, 15, and ramping up in 16, 17, and 18. Overall, there was $17 million spent to spray around a 425,000 hectare treatment area. What they were spraying was BTK, and mostly BTK and tebuconazide. So these are the distributions of how much they use. And here's some of the outcomes on the bottom. So we have L2 counts, where the red again is higher L2 counts, meaning higher population sizes on the Quebec side, blue being lower population sizes. So there tends to be, you know, this almost like this barrier where the advance of that outbreak is. And when you look at defoliation surveys in 2017, we see that there's not a lot of defoliation occurring across that sort of boundary here delineated in blue. So that suggests that perhaps the spray program, which was targeting that area, may have been somewhat successful in reducing the spread of eastern spruce budworm across New Brunswick. From a carbon standpoint, so this is just a diagram that looked at, okay, what are the implications for carbon in our forests of treatment or no treatment? So this is from a spatial simulation model run on Atlantic Canada. You can see in the bottom left. What they're modeling on the y-axis is just the average net ecosystem production, right? This is our carbon budget. Anything below that line, below zero, sorry, the dashed line is a source. You're emitting more carbon than you're sequestering. Anything above that line, you're sequestering more carbon than you're emitting. We have a scenario of moderate defoliation on the left and severe defoliation on the right. Just two things to point out. Lots of lines going on here. The solid red line is a case where there's no protection. You don't do any early intervention. There's no spraying. And you can see that even under moderate defoliation, but particularly under severe defoliation, at least over a period of 15 years, you see that your forest can become a source of carbon. There's more emissions occurring than it is sequestering. And that's due to a lot of dead trees, decomposition occurring. When you have some kind of protection, so all these different colored lines are different combinations of protection, how much area you would spray, how frequently you might do it, you see that in moderate and severe defoliation, you can maintain your forest as a sink. So you're gonna maintain mature trees, they're gonna sequester more carbon than they're releasing, at least over the time frame over which this model was being simulated. So treatment of eastern spruce budworm can have important implications for the carbon being stored or released from our landscapes and our forest systems. Okay, so I wanted to end, I call it limitations of early intervention strategy, but I think it's more things to consider if we want to apply this early intervention strategy or any program of managing eastern spruce budworm with implications for carbon accounting, for biodiversity, and for forest health. So it's costly, right? This spray program, $40 to $70 hectares per year. Funding can be limited in terms of that. So if it's not successful, let's say over the funding period, then it could be a lot of resources that went towards this to then just delay the onset of an outbreak. EAS applications, like the flights, for example, also contribute carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so I think if we're thinking about a carbon budget, we probably need to think about more than just the trees, but also, you know, the emissions from the treatment itself. So maybe this net ecosystem production carbon budget could be primary production minus heterotrophic respiration minus, you know, the airplane jet emissions, right? A simple exercise to try and incorporate that in order to understand the full carbon footprint or budget when we are treating for the eastern spruce budworm. Another thing of importance is albedo, right? Our northern forests, boreal forests are covered in snow for, you know, months and months. I know we're covered for a few months here in Newfoundland, for sure. So the more trees you have, the lower your albedo. Albedo is the reflectance of, or how much radiation or sunlight gets reflected or absorbed by the Earth's surface. The more trees you have, the more absorption you have, the warmer it gets. So budworm actually creates canopy openings, right? When you have severe defoliation, 3, 4, 5 years in a stand, you might see dead, dying trees, which opens up the canopy, meaning there's going to be more snow visible and more reflectance, a higher albedo, which actually cools the climate. So it actually reduces global So there's a positive benefit of having some of those openings on a landscape in terms of a climate change dynamic. And studies find that this change in albedo can offset carbon losses due to death of trees in some areas. So I think this is an interesting piece that probably needs to come into the equation again when we're thinking about a full carbon budget. Soil flux is a really important part of our carbon budget, this heterotrophic respiration, and I think it's something we don't estimate very well. We have a hard time estimating. Postdoc here, Elizabeth Forbes, designed a clever, what she calls a flux bot, to allow us to measure soil respiration in all kinds of different landscapes. So these are do-it-yourself units. There's instructions. They cost about $300 to $400. You can put them across an array of a forest stand, and it will measure, it has a logging bank. You can remotely download the data. And so it opens and closes as you decide when it's closed, it's measuring the emissions from the soil. So you can get an idea of emissions in different sort of forest environments. So when we did this in a study area in Gros Morne, so this is carbon dioxide flux on the y-axis, and we measured put a whole bunch of these flux bots in mature forest stands. So each bot is a dot here. And then moose meadows. The moose meadows are areas where there was a spruce budworm outbreak in the 70s and 80s, and that has failed to regenerate. So the point here I want to make is that there's a lot of variability even in mature forests, even in these previously budworm infected forests with soil flux. So I don't think we have a good handle on the impacts of forest management or eastern spruce budworm even on soil flux. But I think these kind of tools can help us get a handle on that. Early intervention strategy may lead to forest homogenization. So I think we need to be careful in terms of the risks of future disturbances. So this is a diagram from a paper in 2020 where if we have this constant risk where we're allowing disturbances to play out, we have this shifting steady state mosaic, right? Different stands are going to be disturbed at different points in time. And so the distribution of your forest is going to be heterogeneous and might be constant over time. So you're going to see a certain pattern of disturbances. Whereas if we try to manage a forest to keep all the mature trees there, that may have some benefits from a timber standpoint, but I think it also may lead to some risks where now you have a lot of fuel available for disturbances like fire or even for eastern spruce budworm outbreaks. So I think we need to consider future risks when we're managing forests in terms of the heterogeneity we're allowing in terms of stand age. I don't think we have a good understanding yet of some of this early intervention strategy on biodiversity and species at risk. I love this diagram. It was published over a decade ago, and this is a parasitoid host diagram where we have our protagonist, eastern spruce budworm, in the center, and we have other Lepidoptera in the gray boxes. On the bottom, we have different food resources, and then on the top is a whole suite of parasitoids. So this is a super complex system, and we're only looking at parasitoids, Lepidoptera, and some plant species. And we know that our treatments can have an impact on all these Lepidoptera. It doesn't necessarily target eastern spruce budworm only. I think we need to do further research to understand the implications of that on other species, particularly some of our consumers, like birds. We know we have a number of species at risk, bird species at risk in this environment that rely on some of these food resources, small mammals, fish and aquatic systems, even, medium mesocarnivores like American marten that can rely on some of the small mammals that are feeding on these resources that we might be reducing when we're managing spruce budworm. And then finally, there's spruce budworm is not acting alone. It's interacting with other species. This is an image here on the island of Newfoundland. We have large herbivores like moose that really do well in post-budworm infected sites, right? We have a flush of new growth that's palatable. So we see a huge response in moose population abundances, and that can have an impact on how the trajectory of your forest post-disturbance. This is work from a master's student, Emerson Wilson. Again, field studies in Gros Morne and Terre-Neuve National Park, where what we did on the y-axis here is we measured total carbon. So the amount of carbon above ground in trees and grasses and deadwood, the amount of carbon below ground in roots and soils, and different types of plots. So we had in red mature forests, and they had the highest amount of carbon, as you would expect, locked into a lot of large trees. Contrast that in disturbed forests, so recently disturbed forests like either fire or spruce budworm, where moose were allowed to roam and feed freely. We saw they had the lowest, those plots on average here, the straight line in this box plot, had the lowest amount of carbon. So we're seeing this compounding effect of moose herbivory following, let's say, a budworm disturbance. In contrast to areas where we excluded moose. So we have fenced areas, we have an outbreak, we allow it to fence. Those areas where you exclude that large herbivore start approaching or looking a lot more like a mature forest more quickly than areas where you allow moose herbivory to happen. So I'll have to say that there are multiple disturbance agents acting, and so we need to really think about that at a landscape scale. Okay, so just a couple slides or a few slides to end. If we want to get towards healthy Eastern Boreal forest management, I really like this framework put out a few years ago, where there's a lot of focus now on restoration. We need to plant trees. We need to plant trees. But I think that's only one part of the puzzle. These authors are saying we need to, protect, make sure we are considering the valuable biodiversity in a forest that exists. We need to think about how management can feed into that, right? As a sustainable management perspective, and restoration is kind of a third wing. Can we then restore parts of our forest to achieve our biodiversity and broader sort of carbon gains or healthy forest objectives? I think any of this sort of forest management should be placed in an adaptive management framework, right, which requires monitoring to enable learning. From a carbon standpoint, that's pretty tricky because it's hard to get a lot of spatially explicit information on carbon, right? Think of the example I gave about monitoring carbon flux and how difficult that can be. So these authors here have a few ideas or propose a few ideas on how to improve carbon monitoring in our forest management protocols. And I think that's something that's going to be important moving forward. In the end, I think that's going to take a number of resources. We're going to have to lean into remote sensing data, models that are predicting different components of our forests, carbon cycles or biodiversity, simulation models like we see in examples today, and then field plots. So I think that's going to take a number of collaboration between governments and land managers and different NGOs. So with that, I thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Leroux. That was a great presentation, very informative. Now let's move on to the Q&A session. While we're waiting for some participants to finish typing their questions, we can take a moment to fill out a post-webinar survey, and I'm going to launch it now. So there are 2 questions in total. You may need to scroll down to see the next one. And also, I want to gently remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and the recording will soon be available on our website. Well, it seems like there are no questions at this moment. But if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can connect you with Dr. Shawn Leroux. And our next lecture session in this series will take place on next Tuesday, February 25th, 2025, titled An Estimate of Wind Disturbance Impacts to Forest Carbon and Wood Supply on PEI with Matt Angus. All right, now I would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you all for participating in our CIF electronic lectures. And once again, thank you very much to Dr. Leroux for the great presentation. Oh, we actually have a comment. Oh, we have one question. So for Dr. Leroux, could you explain the different colored lines protection scenarios on the slide about the impacts of spruce budworm?
Is that from the simulation model? Is that this one? Or was it the...
Well, Andrew Whitman, if you're still there, could you clarify your question?
Okay.
Okay, that's the one.
So I wasn't involved in this study. So I think there it was a mix of how much area was going to be sprayed, right? Whether you had more area sprayed, less area sprayed. It's fairly intuitive, I think. The more you're going to the more you spray, the more effective this treatment would be, I think, right? So yeah, so I guess I would point you towards that paper. I don't have the full details. All I know is that the red is the no protection, and the other ones are different scenarios where they're combining either the types of spray that you're putting and the amount of spray that they might be applying over this different time frame. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Leroux.
Mhm.
Is that the only question we have? Seems like it. All right. I guess now we can close this session. And thank you, Dr. Leroux.
Thank you,
Bye,
Sharon. Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Yeah.